Today's little Christmas Epiphany homily is a little different format than usual. I'd like to offer 3 points, 3 thoughts, 3 contemporary perspectives, connections to reflect upon the beautiful story of the magi and the journey of life that we are making at this point in time like they did 2,000 years later. First is a reference to a story in the January 1st, 2021 edition of Newsday. An article on page 26 of the paper struck me by its subtitle that said, "Mass participation puts us in line for future hope." Mass participation puts us in line for future hope. That statement was advocating for masses of people receiving the COVID vaccine and therefore hope for the end of the pandemic and a return to normalcy. The line struck me because it came from a Jewish doctor who I know, who's also a rabbi, and although he was speaking about medicine, it could also be applied to faith insofar as mass participation, participating in mass, puts us in line for future hope. So the journey of the Magi symbolizes our own various voyages of faith across the miles and through the years, particularly through the weekly celebration of the Eucharist on Saturday night or Sunday morning. Mass participation puts us in line for hope. The Eucharist gives us direction and nourishment along the often difficult expeditions of life, particularly when we encounter the various King Herods out there trying to trick us into diversions and detours. So your participation in Mass, even though it's not an obligation at this particular time because of the pandemic, is an inspiration. It's an inspiration, I think, to one another. It's an inspiration to me, and perhaps it's also an invitation to others. And for those who are in decent health and not yet back, I'd like to suggest that we encourage and invite them to return to Mass participation so that future hope might begin now because of the beautiful witness of faith that we who are here offer to one another in a very safe, socially distant, and of course prayerful environment. As you can see, even the Magi have arrived socially distant, wearing face masks to make the point. There's mask participation. So I noted in this week's bulletin letter that I hope the obligation to participate in Mass is soon restored, because the longer the Church encourages people to take their time returning, the more likely it will be for people not to return at all in the future. There's a famous line in the movie Field of Dreams where Kevin Costner hears a message from above saying, "If you build it, they will come," referring to building the baseball stadium. Likewise, if we keep suggesting alternate forms of being church apart from in-person participation, some folks might conclude, "I don't need this anymore." So the Magi could have said, we don't have to trek all the way to Bethlehem. It's too long, it's too risky, it's too dangerous. And history would have been denied this wonderful message of the journey of faith. So they could have lost their way. They could have lost their lives when they ran into Herod, but they persevered in spite of the struggle and the challenges. And then they returned home by a different route. And that's a very important line in the Gospel. So Mass participation puts us in line for future hope, even now. The second point I'd like to make also comes from another article in the January 1st Newsday edition, page 18, and it's about the famous actor, Anthony Hopkins, who played the part of Pope Benedict XVI in one of his more recent films. The story is actually about the most important role that Anthony Hopkins has played in his life, namely celebrating his 45 years of personal sobriety. That story over the last 45 years is a good message for all of us coming through a difficult year and beginning 2021. And so he said in this article that he's had difficult days in between, and sometimes he's had doubts and temptations to pick up again. But all in all, I keep saying to myself and everyone, hang in there. And the article said, interestingly, after his epiphany, that's their word, after his epiphany, after he stopped drinking, he spoke to a woman from AA who said, why don't you just trust in God and let go? His desire to drink, he told people, would never return. Now, he tells everyone, today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday. He says, don't give up, just keep fighting, be bold, and mighty forces will come to your aid. This is going to be the best year. So I think that's a good message for us as we reflect upon the long, the uncertain, at times the detour journey of the Magi. And we ourselves try to hang in there, step by step, one day at a time, returning by a new route over and over again, in spite of all of the forces of addiction and treachery and evil that's always out there, with the Herods outside, and also the Herods within us. So that's the second point I'd like to make. Even after the Magi left Bethlehem, they had more work to do, searching for God on further journeys inwardly. The third point I'd like to make is more about the nemesis of the Epiphany story, King Herod. Historians say that he's one of the worst dictators in history. Not only did he massacre the Holy Innocents, he also killed some of his own children, and one of his kids that he didn't kill was the other Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded. Theologians debate actually when he died, and that's an interesting point because some people have him dying before Jesus was born. But it's an interesting point because he's really still alive today in various incarnations. So I'd like to draw your attention to an article in this week's bulletin by a medical doctor who heads up our diocesan pro-life office, Dr. Lisa Honkanen. And the article connects with this past week's Feast of the Holy Innocents, and it highlights how the Herods of our own day are killing even more innocent life than the Herod of old, particularly in our state of New York through the Reproductive Health Act. This may not be the nicest topic to talk about during the Christmas season, but it's needed and appropriate as we hear about the after effects of the Magi's visit to the Christ child. What happened after they left? So the Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, so they didn't return via Jerusalem, went back by a different way. That detour infuriated Herod and led to the slaughter of the innocents. So I suggest you read the article in the bulletin and how it relates to the here and now, and perhaps consider writing to our governor who gleefully signed this horrific piece of legislation, the most permissive abortion law in America, that has already led to more destruction of life than Herod ever caused. If you do so, and I hope you will, you probably won't get a response, but you may, like me, get on his mailing list and receive a holiday card, not a Christmas card, but a holiday card from him and his daughters, wishing, quote, everyone who calls New York home a bright future. Well, that is to say, everyone outside the womb. For many unborn in New York, there is no future, not to mention many of the nursing homes. So Herod didn't die 2,000 years ago, he lives on. And so like the Magi, we have to try to make and take some strategic routes around Herod's evil machinations. Every voice, every letter, every outcry matters because all lives matter, especially the most vulnerable. And so our mass participation in this endeavor, one step at a time, will save lives. A very active parishioner here at Cure recently noted that he has been reflecting on the line in the Gospel that follows immediately after the passage we hear today. Herod is out to destroy the child. And the child, of course, happens to be God. The Herods of today aren't just after life in the womb, but they also want to destroy and eliminate, or at least diminish, the notion of God and religious freedom. Over the past year, in many ways, the spirit of Herod was very successful in trying to snuff out God in public and the private domains of many lives. People were shut down and shut up. Many people in various regions couldn't gather to worship. And so it sort of happened gradually, and then it became very evident, the tactic. And sometimes we don't even notice things happening in our lives or in our world only after a period of time. Here's an example. Notice that on the windowsills, the scented candles, they aren't lit today or anymore. That's because last week a parishioner noticed that his face mask was blackened and filled with soot from the candles. Who would have thought? Lots of people have Yankee candles at home. And so this soot was building up, and you take the mask off, you could see it was all black inside, so that's why there's no more candles. This is the end of the Christmas smells here at Jure. And we are what we breathe in, like pollution or soot. It becomes part of us, just like the food that we eat we become what we eat. And likewise, we're affected by what we take into our minds and what comes into our hearts. So only gradually are people coming to notice the soot, the grime, the smoke, and the gradual diminishment, diminution, destruction of faith-based activities and communities. Herod is still after the child, the grown-up child now. So like the Magi, we have to strategize how we can live in a secular world, taking different routes to navigate around the Herods of today rather than to accommodate the profane agenda. And when you think about this beautiful story that we hear, the irony in Matthew's story was that pilgrim pagans, these masked magi, journeyed far from home because they believed that God was doing something new, while the leaders of the chosen people read their scriptures but no longer expected God to reveal anything new. The religious leaders of Jerusalem had worked out this sort of uneasy but relatively peaceful accommodation with the Roman Empire. Rome allowed the clergy and the people to function so long as they didn't rock the boat. And so the Jewish people enjoyed some degree of freedom to practice their religion, but in today's terms, they were living in something between accommodation and complicity. And so the question is, how do we, as Catholics, fit in at this juncture? What can we do? And so at the beginning of this new year, the Magi might be inviting us to read the signs of the times, to read the stars, to look for epiphanies of God among us, and to allow mystery to shake us out of our status quo and beyond the borders of our comfortable relationships and thought patterns. Like the Magi, we may not know exactly what we're looking for, but if we set our sights high enough, God will not hesitate to lead us into new epiphanies where we'll meet God among us, like the Magi did, in very unexpected and wildly rich ways. And that's why on this Feast of the Epiphany, we can say again, Merry Christmas on this little Christmas, because of the mission and the work that we have to do in Mass participation and in bringing the effects of what we celebrate here at the Eucharist into the world this year.